Good evening, everyone. So on behalf of my colleagues, again, in the Masters in Urban Planning and Policy, Urban Design, particularly my long-term partner in crime, who's hiding behind but is no less guilty, Mona Harib, the wonderful team at the Beirut Urban Lab that has made this whole thing possible, MSFEA and AUB that always generously support us, but also my family in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research that's co-sponsoring this event. Welcome to City Debates 2024. I'm used to starting City Debates with a happy, joyful mood. I reference Santa Claus. I talk about it bringing us new ideas, new people, old friends, new ones, conversations to Beirut, to AUB, to our School of Design, to the graduate programs. And for the past 20 years, we've had this conference really as a precious moment to engage with colleagues and students in intense theoretical and practical discussions where we approach the challenge of our times as urbanists, as scholars, as practitioners. We talk about topics that stem from our world, from our immediate world, which was questions that trouble us to discuss, and ways in which we want to make sense of the word, issues we would like to address with our students. We find ways to try and contribute to our region, think comparatively with colleagues from other regions, and engage the practices of urban planning and design, trespassing beyond our academic walls, but still in conversation with our scholarly community. And usually after city debates, I should say students are on a high. In the beginning, they used to say, I feel like I just went inside the book for a week. Now they say I just went inside YouTube for a week. But it's still like the same feeling of like having an experience. Sadly, it's hard to be in such a joyful mood today. We are on the 152nd day of war on Gaza, and it didn't start, of course, 152 days ago. Cities and refugee camps are in rubble, and land is devastated. And we are still counting the dead, and sometimes thinking, maybe often, that death is mercy. The death toll is also staggering in the West Bank and in South Lebanon. Palestine is being erased. I don't know what I did with this. Palestine is being erased in front of our eyes. So I'll start by asking you for a minute of silence for people who are suffering right now. Thank you. So organizing a conference in times like this was no easy task. To be sure, I can hardly think of a city debate edition we did in the last 20 years when we were not concerned with a last-minute challenge. And it's actually the first time where no one canceled in the last minute, which is really amazing. The current circumstances are harsh, but being in Beirut, this is absolutely not exceptional. Through the years, we've felt the urge to keep our voices up in the region, the urge to keep discussing, thinking together loudly, as our first step in braving oppression and injustices in a region sadly notorious for its attack on free speech and free ideas. This year, however, the critical questions are hard to answer. What can we talk about, and how can talking even help? And who does it even support when less than 280 kilometers away, children are dying of starvation and thirst? Is it complicit, delusional, and what hope can we accomplish? In the past months, I have, and I'm guessing many others, really reconsidered for the nth time my career. Why didn't I become a doctor? Why didn't I study law at least, right? I mean, done something where I can make a difference. And this overwhelming feeling of futility and uselessness and sadness left me wondering whether it's even ethical to organize a conference in times like this. At the Beirut Urban Lab, we began to look for ways in which we can put our skill set to use, and I'll just give one example for those of you who are not familiar, the mapping escalation. Using our mapping skill in a place where it's normally not used, trying to show how the war was coming closer to Lebanon. That's one of the many projects. There's been mapping of Gaza and work on the West Bank. But there are things that propel us also to keep talking and sharing and organizing collective discussions and reflections, learning, sharing, imagining, and writing. And I just want to mention a few without taking too much time. The first and possibly the most important one is to defy silencing. Already in November, Ghassan Haj, incidentally our keynote speaker, I was reminded yesterday looking at the poster for City Debates 2, shared a feeling that, and I'm going to quote him, the Gaza war is firmly propelling us along a historical path where the warrior will rule over the intellectual, a word determined to devalorize the work of thinking critically, and where I, as an academic, will belong to less and less. Haj was reflecting on this idea of shut up or less, a culture he experienced during the civil war in Lebanon, where, having engaged in an argument with someone who disagreed with him, incidentally, that the Palestinians didn't want to turn Lebanon into their Palestine, he found himself with many arguments, but the other person short of argument. And what the other person did is he went and said, "Would you like me to get my gun?" Until recently, many of us thought that the shut up or else was just here, right, in the Arab world. To be sure, there are things we cannot say, and I particularly welcome colleagues coming from Egypt who I know have been suffering an incredible shut up or else. But maybe Haj and us too were quite naive in thinking that shut up or less is just in the Arab world. As Haj experienced himself recently when he was asked to step down from his position in the Max Planck Institute because, and I kid you not, he is racist. We've learned that actually silencing is expanding everywhere. So this is what many have lived through for the past months, being silenced, losing jobs, being cast as anti-Semitic. Clearly, shut up or less is not only part of our region. So in these circumstances, organizing a discussion in which we could learn, share, think collectively, and imagine otherwise make a difference. And I think for that, I am incredibly grateful to AUB for remaining that unique space in which we can defend our ideas. It's a space where we can say whatever we want, and I sincerely invite you to defy whatever you think is a boundary and imagine with us in the coming days in a space which is unique in the Arab world and beyond in its ability to cultivate free speech. I forgot to mention something, and it's important in this context, is that the event is part of Palestine Week, and Bana is here, and she's done an amazing job in bringing Palestine to the center of this free speech and this discussion and demonstrating this idea in the last few days. I'll try to be briefer because I know everyone wants to hear Nour, but the second point I want to talk about is also the responsibility we share as academics in putting forward different political imaginaries. There's a lot of work in imagining alternative futures, particularly from the position of a department of architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, and urban design. It's become common to represent, for very good reason, planning as the bad guy, right? We all know those guys we used to teach our students, Patrick Geddes, Abercrombie, and others who came to Jaffa, to Jerusalem, designed the extension of the cities, and were a part of the settler colonial project. In this context, we see the importance of reconsidering the profession. That assumes state actors to be natural custodians of the common good. Conversely, we ask, can planning still be a framework in which we can forge new imaginaries for being together? Can some of the tools of architecture and planning allow us to project, perform different kinds of collectivities? And if not, what avenues do we propose as academic pathways, spaces for such opportunities? I find myself encouraging my students to really try and use their design skill to imagine first and foremost Beirut otherwise. I also often assign them and show them the work of Sandy Hilal, Imagining Otherwise in Palestine. And read with them this week Nour Joudah asking us to think liberational futures in Gaza. Ask them to deploy their tools of design in the realm of possibilities. I know Huwaida is doing this about Gaza. She's done this about Aleppo and many other places. So perhaps the questions we're faced today, and I imagine many of you, particularly the professionals, are being asked, like me, to design what should we do for Gaza. In the last few weeks, I've had several calls, invitations to universities in the United States. They want to design the day after. And I think it's an incredibly difficult question to answer because on the one hand, we have 2.2 million people who don't have a home. And on the other, we're asked to be complicit and to redesign the concentration camp. And I cannot imagine myself actually doing that. So I think that as planners, as designers, that imagining otherwise is not beautiful language which is trite on paper. We have in front front of us an immediate challenge, and I'm sincerely hoping that comparatively, thinking with other regions and other people who have thought about a different role for public actors, a different role for our profession, that we can indeed disrupt the practice of planning and bring to it those hopeful futures. And finally, the last point is perhaps the point of for organizing a conference, is the one that has to do with why city debates in the first place and why disruptions. And disruptions came with the idea perhaps of bringing together all the themes that we had in the previous years and bringing them together and trying to readdress them in a more integral way as forces that disrupt the progressive potential of our profession. So I wanted to also celebrate the fact that it is our 20th edition and to bring some of these themes to you and brag a little bit about what we've done. So I'm going to run very quickly through these pictures. So this is the first official city debate back in 2003. Mona and I looked really much younger. I was even wearing heels. I was shocked. And you can see in the bottom picture Abdou Malik Simon, who invited himself because he felt like joining city debates and actually reached out to Mona Harib, who was organizing this event, and said, I want to be part of this. Since then, it's been quite a journey. We tried to engage more critical issues as of year 2. We asked Lamine Beirut and Nadine, who's now a colleague and was then a graduate student in the MUPP program, was a journalist in parallel, and she was writing every day, and Mona Harib found those yesterday, so we were reading them and laughing. Some of the common themes of that sense of exclusion stayed with us in 2006. It was spaces for the rich, with colleagues more or less more regional. The year after, 2005, I had organized something on heritage, which remains critical. It was the first time we invited people from Jordan. We had slightly bigger budget. The big story is that I worked so hard to get one sponsor for every speaker that I had my first child the first day of the conference, so I never attended it. One massive theme that stayed with us is war. Since 2006, it's been a main part of our immediate life and city debates life. In 2007, following the first war, the nth war on Lebanon from Israel, we organized city debates with the reconstruction unit on the theme of post-disaster recovery, and eventually Huwaida from the reconstruction unit published an edited volume. The theme of displacement and recovery stayed with us, and you can see many editions. This is 2019 and Huwaida's book. It's always been something that we try to connect with academic conversations, but also with the region. Crisis as well in 2019 when we tried to recover, and friends we lost along the way. This is our late colleague Robert Saliba, who then gave a fantastic conversation on how we can pull planning out and be more hopeful with urban design as a tool for change. He had organized several city debates, including the one on urban design in the Arab world, and published books from it. In 2008, Asif Bayat came here for the first time, and Mona had organized Spaces of Faith and Fun. This is the city debate we had to push because there was a war in May between the different factions here in Beirut. So we had to change that, and we pushed it back to the fall after. Security, which came back to the theme with Omar Sirri, and he'll talk about it tomorrow, was a major concern as it began to occupy militarized security, occupying everyday street spaces. This I organized with Hiba Bouakar. We had a lot of fun and talk about one speaker per, I think it was 20 speakers, 20 sponsors. We died. But it happened. And after that, we had a benchmark we had to keep, so we kept it. Informality, a room always full, friends, some of you will recognize yourselves here, and then many we've lost actually, again, along the way. I tried to put as many pictures and didn't have enough time. Property, Omar Razaz was here on the first edition. He was here right before he became prime minister in Jordan, and participated on discussions of property. COVID pushed us online. Last year, we came back, and always loved this edition of City Debates that was about social movements and change, Sous les pavés la plage, and very much inspired by Henri Lefebvre with Adania, Asef, Rima, and many others. And I just wanted to say how much this conference is actually the result of that collective work. So that's 20 years of City Debates. I'm going to skip the rest of the introduction just to jump to the thank yous because I've been way too long. I just really want to ask you for a round of hands for Antonia and Isabella. I take the credit. They really did it. Siwar, Serene, everyone in ARD and MSFEA, including the technical team in the back, without whom you would be hearing echoes all over in the room. And no internet until 5 p.m. There was a breakdown today. Colleagues in the department, everyone, your support, your smiles, your presence, your designs, your help, your championing Huwaida, really. Our alumni who always come back every year, and it's so awesome to see you when you come. And also the speakers, those who have invested, who come to the region, and then those who don't have a relationship with the region, but still said without hesitation yes in seconds, despite the fact that there's a war, and that they probably got dozens of warning. I went to Colombia, to Colombia in New York last month, and since then I get 4 or 5 warnings every day because the system they put me on tell me what is happening in the region. So I know what you guys live if you're coming from the US. Thank you so much for coming. It means a lot to us. The scholarly community exists and its conversations are important precisely because of this commitment. So thank you. Thank you, my IJURR family, Eduardo, Majo, and Walter, for being here, and for those who will join online. And finally, old friends, previous City Debate participants, new one, welcome everyone. Look forward to a great 2 days of conversations. Yeah. And finally, I can introduce the speaker. So allow me to introduce finally the speaker. I know you all came for her, not for me, so I'm sorry I took so much time. Nour is assistant professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at UCLA and a former president and Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow in geography at UC Berkeley. Dr. Joudah completed her PhD in geography in UCLA and wrote her dissertation, Mapping Decolonized Futures, Indigenous Visions for Hawaii and Palestine, on the efforts by Palestinian and native Hawaiian communities to imagine and work towards liberated futures while centering indigenous duration and the nonlinear temporality. So you see a lot of the echoes in the column I'm making. Her full bio is online on this website, so I won't read all of it. With us to discuss her presentation are City Debates' old friend and many-time co-organizer, Hiba Bouakar. She's associate professor at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University. Her research focuses on planning in conflict and post-conflict cities, the question of urban violence, and the role of religious political organizations and aid organizations in the making of cities. Her award-winning book, For the War Yet to Come, Planning Beirut's Frontier, examined the contested geographies of Beirut's post-Civil War peripheries. She's also the founder and director of the Post-Conflict Cities Lab at Columbia University. And last but not least, a colleague in the same school, Rami Zre, professor at the American University of Beirut, and who joined us from the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences in the Department of Landscape Design and Ecosystem Management. Professor Zre serves as the interim director of the Palestine Land Studies Center since 2022. He was a member of the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of the Committee of World Food Security from 2015 and 2019. He has numerous more achievements and 3 great books you absolutely should read. Check his bio online, please. Without more delay, Dr. Joudah, the floor is yours. I'm sorry I took so much time, and welcome everyone again.
Okay, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here, and let's see if I can position this paper in a right way. Thank you to the City Debates team for the very kind invitation of opening this wonderful event. that is rooted in so much critical work and an ethic of building better spaces so that our communities can have better lives. I will be very honest with you that for me, talks and presentations since October 7th that I have given during the ongoing genocide have gone one of two ways. Either I managed to make it through the presentation in a composed mode, or some sentence that I had previously read a dozen times hits me in a new way, and the rest of the talk becomes a series of moments of trying to regain my composure. So I hope for your sake and mine that tonight is the former. This project, which I will hopefully be sharing with you tonight, is first and foremost, as Mona mentioned, about embracing Indigenous futures and having faith in the potential of the past and present to create something new moving forward. A potential, of course, for all of us, especially right now, that every day is more and more difficult to fathom. As academics, we love our frameworks, don't we? We love our frameworks and our categories, and we tell ourselves that they are epistemological and ontological tools, and I think that it makes us feel better to find places where we and our work fits in. And they have their purposes, sure, but we also all know or should know that these tools constrain us and can constrain us as much as they can open doors of thought and learning. Often academic research and the media present a collective refusal to surrender in a very narrow frame of resistance, limiting and confining community power to survival despite loss. This sort of survival despite narrative regrettably places elimination and displacement instead of creativity and growth at the core of conversations on Indigenous duration. While settler colonial invasion is, of course, a structure driven by the first, Indigenous resurgence is empowered by the latter, and a belief that each of us can shape what comes next. Sumud, in Arabic, is a term that translates most often in English to steadfastness, but it encompasses concepts and experiences of perseverance, survival, determination, and much more. It has come to be a central identifying characteristic, of course, of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and is used widely to express duration with purpose, duration that looks ahead, and is always moving and operating in the language of futures. Sumud is not solitary. It is never a journey of one, but a collective experience that ties us to one another. It is unbound by time, nonlinear, and wholly unconcerned with any of our frameworks or categories. Similarly, so are the stories of Algeria, Palestine, and Hawaii, past, present, future, and everything simultaneous and in between. Looking specifically today to mapping initiatives, I will try to share a glimpse with you tonight of Indigenous efforts that defy settler temporalities and work to actively build emancipatory futures. I want to spend most of tonight discussing Palestine and Hawaii, but I did want to take a brief step back and also introduce the site and case that inspired the larger project, Algeria. My draw to Algeria was due to two things: a fascination with the debate on its status as a settler colony, and the story of the counter-state during the War of Independence. In July 1954, 4 months before the National Liberation Front, or the FLN, launched the War of Independence, and 2 full years before it adopted a political program, it established a counter-state to French Algeria, and it redrew the map. They transformed the 3 coastal French departments into 6 wilayat, or provinces, each wilaya with a corresponding political and military leadership. The Algerian resistance defied French spatial organization of their communities, their cities, and their state beyond the abstraction of anti-colonial discourse. In a very material sense of embodied experience, the FLN's new map became a guidepost for how Algerians understood their cities and districts. The wilayat became a living countermap to the colonial state and of its colonized indigenous population. Taking the audacity and certainly sense of humor of their endeavor one step further, they mapped the 7th Wilaya onto Paris, confronting colonial logic on the boundaries of the French state. If France could map onto them, then why couldn't they map onto France? My research into this period that inspired my turn to exploring maps as practice and gateways for exploration also eventually led to the heart of this project, which is that indigenous communities are using mapping as an imaginative and decolonial praxis. Though Algeria is not yet fully integrated into the comparison, it is undeniably where my most important questions began. My approach in principle and analysis is grounded in and driven by a personal and intellectual desire, ethic, and need to do more than record history or fine-tune theory. Rejecting fatalism and embracing resurgence must mean more than an adoption of decolonial discourse or uplifting indigenous voices, though both are essential. It is about taking our conversations on colonization out of abstraction and engaging with aspirations, indigenous aspirations, as guides for decolonial thought and, more importantly, action. When Patrick Wolf writes that settler colonialism has been impervious to regime change, he is not saying that decolonization is impossible, but that it is a structure that cannot be dismantled by one election, political party, campaign, or policy. If we look then at a case like Algeria, one finds a process that highlights this reality. Algeria today is, and Algeria's War of Independence then, was more than anti-colonial struggle. Settler evacuation is neither the end point nor the example of successful decolonization. Algeria's relationship with France is more than lingering post-colonial relation. Its counter-state period, as well as multiple post-independence remappings, highlight that lack of spatial separation that exists among empire, settlement, and internal colony that authors like Tuck and Yang lay out. One could choose to understand the FLN mappings as responses or moves towards status recognition. However, I would argue that they are about something else altogether. They are a look inward, a reconfiguration of indigenous spaces, and a prime example of what Glenn Coulthard calls a critical, individual, and collective self-recognition. If we understand indigenous resurgence as Coulthard and Simpson and Alfred do, not as a desire to return to the past, but a way to escape the rigidity of our present, we can, as academics and disciplines and neighbors, stop relegating indigenous life to a distant past or an entrenched presence. Focusing on specific indigenous mapping projects of Palestine and Hawaii, I am working to forge a better understanding of how settler imaginaries and indigenous spatial knowledge systems are expressed or erased in current maps, and how they continue to be repurposed and reimagined for the future. I examine the Hawaiian and Palestinian cases through visual analysis and extensive interviews with activists, NGO staff, and project leaders. The study, of course, is not a paired comparison of the two sites with a rigid list of variables, but instead is a humble attempt and a step toward relational comparison that explores how these seemingly distant locales take part in producing similar processes. Therefore, while I zoom in on each place and counter-mapping initiative for in-depth looks at specific projects in these sites, the narratives underline several themes on participation and labor in mapping and content creation, and how that work contributes to develop alternative futures. My approach, I hope, like the work of indigenous communities highlighted here, shows how these communities are refilling emptied and emptying landscapes and challenging settler temporalities or experiences of time. Whether through a reclamation of archives or land itself, these indigenous initiatives and individuals are not only rejecting fatalism or any sense of a fait accompli, but they are also offering a future to work toward and using the process of imagining that future, as a way to strengthen themselves. By putting settler colonies in conversation with each other across space and time, I want to encourage all of us to challenge the tendency in settler colonial studies of matching cases by apex of historical trajectory. Though relational comparison can take numerous forms and is a long and evolving process, I try to center these three main guiding principles. And in doing so, I try my best to harness natural ebbs and flows from key and broad geographical and political questions to very site-specific issues. The project blends visual analysis with these interviews to examine the technical and political considerations of individuals and projects that are documenting, archiving, and remapping indigenous spaces and lands. Due to continued Israeli denials of my entry to Palestine, I conducted most of my interviews with participants in the West Bank and Gaza over Skype and Zoom, and then conducted interviews in Lebanon, Turkey, and Hawaii in person. Oops, I went one too far. Stay on this for a minute. The chapters I'm building now cover mapping spaces and futures via archiving, imagining reconstruction, and embodied resistance. One chapter focuses on two archive and map platforms. One I'm sure you're mostly familiar with, Palestine Open Maps, by Visualizing Palestine, and the other is called the Papakilo and Kipuka databases by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Another explores the Palestine Land Society's Village Reconstruction Competition, which we'll talk a bit about today, and another looks at the potential of considering direct actions, such as the protest camp at Mauna Kea in Hawaii, as embodied and performative countermapping. We'll zoom in today to give you a more significant look at the chapter that covers of the Village Reconstruction Competition. But before that, I want to just take a look at some of the key points of the others. So the Palestine Open Maps and Papakilo and Kipuka databases. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. I never would have gotten back here. She's doing a lot of, I'll do my best to not touch things as much as I can. That's okay, go ahead. Okay, I'll just hold the paper. Palestine Open Maps and the Papakilo and Kipuka databases are treasure troves of information, accessible online, easily searchable, and still growing. Here I look at not only the indigenous labor in building these databases of colonial materials and indigenous knowledge, but also the consequences of redefining terms, limits, and purposes of documentation. These sites serve as a direct and targeted challenge to colonial goals of using archives to meticulously document, while simultaneously using those archives to dismiss the past's relevance for the future. Borrowing from John Agnew's work on the territorial trap, I introduce in this chapter the concept of the settler colonial temporal trap and the importance of indigenous experiences of time. If considering the territoriality of states in historical context is meant to have us break the binding of the territorial trap, then indigenous activation of pasts as a way to move toward liberated futures shatters the settler colonial temporal trap. What I'm referring to here is an attempt to explain how just as settler colonialism destroys to replace spaces, it does the same with producing time. It does not just erase histories or extend dispossession to the archive, it refuses the possibility of an indigenous future. It works to destroy a holistic temporality. Reviving and repurposing historical documents, maps, oral histories, and other records, Hawaiians and Palestinians build these databases and platforms that serve as resources and, more importantly, as a catalyst for looking ahead. These projects are not tucked away for the mere sake of documentation. Instead, they are informed by a wide network of other indigenous sources, initiatives, integrating oral histories, and hoping to grow via user input. By activating the past as a move toward futures, these Palestinian and Hawaiian databases and map platforms stand in defiance of settler time. Performing the countermap is a chapter that poses the potential of understanding direct actions, whether protest or via land restoration, as a category of performative cartography. Indigenous countermapping and performative cartographies have largely been discussed separately, with the former centered on visual, textual efforts, and the latter a historical assertion of presence and survival of self and knowledge. However, what is still missing is the consideration of embodied performative countermapping, a cartographic challenge to hegemonic state maps that occurs with the presentation of indigenous bodies in spaces the state has mapped as off limits. Drawing from time at Mauna Kea and with Kanaka Native Hawaiian activists in Oahu, as well as interviews with the founders of Hui Mau Land Initiative, I depict groups and individuals who have centered restoration of plant life and the physical presence of their bodies to reclaim and recreate indigenous spaces. The presence of Hawaiians at Mauna Kea and those working on land restoration in East Hamakua are bringing to life the maps they want to see. These spaces are filled with an embodied performative countermapping that actualizes refusal of settler encroachment as well as the building of decolonized spaces, placing their bodies on the land and using their bodies to cultivate and change it. These individuals and movements pose physical cartographic challenge to settler state invasion. They are not presenting a suggestion, an alternative map. They are instead creating the conditions of the map that they find acceptable, cordoning off sacred sites and planting future foods. Okay, so our main focus for today. Mahmoud Darwish, God knows he manages to stay timely. Mahmoud Darwish once wrote that in 1 minute, the whole life of a house ends. That a house murdered is also mass murder, even if vacant of its residents. He goes on, as the memory of things get murdered, he says, they all scatter in fragments like beings. Items break like their owners break because all these things are the memories of people who were emptied of things, and the memories of things that were emptied of people. Now, often, for many of us, nostalgia and imagining the future are seen as opposites, as opposed temporalities and spaces. However, critical acts of remembering, especially with indigenous struggle, is an inextricable part of imagining the future and working to realize it. The Palestine Land Society competition, which I'll lay out here, exemplifies how mapping can serve as an imaginative and generative practice. In the village designs, we see how countermapping by way of imagining future spatial expression is both a form of resurgence and a challenge to the narrative of linear settler time. The competition, for which you see a poster here, and for which AUB students participate, began in 2017. It charges young Palestinian architecture students with reconstructing and designing the destroyed villages of 1948. As an initiative, it builds on the organization and Salman Abu Sitta's decades-long work to archive, publish, and reframe mostly British mappings, now taking a step toward reviving pre-Nakba spaces. As a large majority of the hundreds of destroyed Palestinian villages were never built over by Israeli settlers, PLS is also challenging the Israeli argument of unavailable space for refugee return. This current project is the fruit not only of the documentation in the Atlas of Palestine and more recent historical work on the Exploration Fund, but a larger project at PLS to engage in the material possibilities of refugee return. With almost 10,000 files now of archival material, PLS, which are coming to AUB in their entirety, PLS has robust folders on approximately 480 destroyed Palestinian villages. Participating students are given historical data, hand-drawn maps from living Nakba survivors, many of which are taken from hundreds of village histories, British mandate surveys, current Google satellite imagery, demographics of the residents and descendants. Abu Sitta, PLS's founder, told me the competition flowed naturally from the process of documentation. We asked ourselves eventually what to do with all of these village files. We have to make them usable, and we ended up here. Currently, 8 universities are participating, 5 in Palestine, 2 in Jordan, 1 in Lebanon, maybe. And this has expanded now to include Palestinians in the US and Europe. University students majoring in architecture and urban planning redesign these villages on the very same village site, but with updated services using data on the projected population. These submissions include the design for rebuilding the village today, as well as a written component which considers historical characteristics of the location. While PLS has set certain parameters for the participants, students are largely free to explore and interpret as they see fit. They are asked to keep villages on the original site and lands, to preserve remaining landmarks, and to incorporate as much data as possible. Despite these limited parameters and an incredibly diverse set of submissions in the last now 7-8 years, a large majority of the submissions have a series of common key features. Some are less surprising: public squares, museums, attempts to address new road systems, and the use of oral histories and Google satellite imagery. But perhaps the most interesting commonality is the presence of guest houses or reunion hostels for refugees or Palestinians in diaspora who choose not to return permanently, but would need housing when visiting, showing a deep awareness of the complicated questions that would arise with reconstruction. Echoing Abu Sitta's guiding ethic that you document to know what you lost and therefore to find ways to recover it, all of the participants I spoke to insisted that for them this project was different. It did not feel like another cultural endeavor or remembrance of the Nakba. Before we take a look at some of these designs, I want to present a suggestion and shift to you that I'm making here for how we understand dwelling space and its relation to time. Let's start first with what Tim Ingold calls the dwelling versus building perspective. The differentiation rests largely on the creation of meaning through activity versus meaning that has been previously attached. Ingold defines the dwelling perspective as one that treats the immersion of an organism, person in an environment or life world as an inescapable condition of existence. From this perspective, basically, the world comes into being around the inhabitant, and its manifold constituents take on significance through an incorporation and regular pattern of life activity. Alternatively, the building perspective, what he says is the more widely applied understanding in social and cultural anthro, is when people are understood to inhabit a world of culture and society to which form and meaning have been previously attached, right? So to construct the world in a consciousness before they can act in it. Ingold actually uses the architect, for all the architects here in the room today, specifically as a prime example of this building perspective. The architect, he says, wants to first plan and build the houses and then import people to occupy them. Ingold contends that this does not accurately reflect human experiences of people's relationship to the environment, since it is in the process of dwelling, of living, that individuals and communities build, and it is only in the capability of dwelling that one can build. So if houses are living organisms with life histories and unfolding relations, as Ingold and Bleyer and others suggest, then what do we make of houses taken, of houses destroyed and erased? Here I want us to think back to Darwish's words of mass murder and memories emptied. This destruction, particularly in the collective form of indigenous spaces, necessitates an expanded and more nuanced understanding of inhabiting, and in turn what it means to dwell before building. Nachi Bluebarn, an indigenous scholar, explains that inhabiting describes a frame used for establishing belonging or home, a relation to place. Sometimes it is rooted in possession, both of land and of Indianness, to signal differing notions of relationship. But mostly it is a process of legitimization for bodily presence in specific locations, either individual or collective. Now, at first glance, I think it could seem to many of us, if not all, that the PLS competition and much of what architects do is the quintessential embodiment of the building perspective. However, as you listen to these young architects describe their process, another vision takes shape entirely. These spaces are not empty abstractions to be organized. nor are their buildings void of life because the refugees are presently absent. Instead, they are windows to paused life worlds, deprived of the daily interactions that come with dwelling, but overflowing with collective relations and legitimization. With exile and refugeedom comes the need for these Palestinians to embody dwelling precisely in a manner that supersedes the mere fact of occupation and grounds dwelling in a temporality that is not confined to the present. Mark Rifkin describes indigenous duration as operating less as a chronological sequence than as overlapping networks of affective connection. Via methods such as storying and I add mapping, indigenous peoples reclaim and remake settler colonial violence to a shared language and time that allows for futures and possibility. Palestinians, as I mentioned, would call this indigenous duration sumud. More than mere survival, it embodies connection and an ongoing sense of presence, steadfastness in moving forward. Until now, the idea of dwelling space, mapping dwelling space, was considered a momentary expression, produced in relation and through interaction. It has been largely discussed and utilized for residential land and shifting paths of plant gathering at rural sites. I am proposing that the concept lends itself particularly well to counter-mapping efforts by indigenous communities who work both to remember pasts and imagine futures. In the PLS competition, the Palestinian participants and their designs take the concept of dwelling space into the future in a very literal sense. The narratives and images that follow exemplify what I am terming a dwelling to rebuild perspective. This production of space and the Palestinians who would inhabit it reflect a reality of displacement and dispossession. The spaces that indigenous communities map is not confined to this moment. Dwelling space here is not only a momentary expression of houses and land emptied in a distant past, but a vision of building and reviving those spaces and the interactions that once filled them. The second place prize in 2019 went to a group of 5 students from right here at AUB. The first group submission to the competition at the time in its first 3 years, this was also a unique interview process for me, as I had an opportunity to speak with them before and after they completed their design. All 5 of the students were drawn to participate in the competition partly for political reasons or family heritage, but more than anything, they were captivated by the idea of challenging themselves to design an emptied space at such a large scale. Until now, by their telling, projects in their architecture or urban planning courses focused on much smaller scales, but the opportunity to imagine the life world of an entire village was something they simply could not pass up, they said. They told me what makes their design so special is that it's not a reflection of one perspective, but 5. Part of Abu Sitta's vision for this competition has been to not only show the physical possibilities of reconstruction, but also strike debate and conversation over what this could look like. To hear these students talk as a group is perhaps one of the most representative moments of this. The ethics of group work was very important to us, they explained. Not any one of the villagers will have liberated Palestine. That will be the manifestation of an entire nation's will. We cannot deny the power of working together now or when they return. If each of us had been working alone, we would not have had the conversations we did that led to critical things in the design, like drowning the road. This Israeli road that you see here in the image, which cuts through the village's lands today, is a key component in their design. They decided to literally drown the road and revive the Ain, or spring, for which the town was named. The students propose rebuilding Ain Ghazal by reviving its source of life first, a new spatial interpretation of the Ain, explaining that it was not only homes and buildings destroyed, but the landscape itself was disfigured, and that the road now cut through the fertile terraces which used to bear many fruit and olive trees. The structure they design and seen here serves as both a housing tower for returning refugees as well as functional reservoir to collect rainwater, to reconnect the landscape, and act as a bridge between the past of the village and its future. In their second interview, having now completed the design and waiting for competition results, they were eager to show me what they'd accomplished. 6 months earlier, they had practically no design vision to share. but were intrigued by the idea of the competition. Now they were jumping out of their seats to describe and point to image details. As you're driving through the main road, the first thing you're going to see is our project, which is intended to be the gate of the village. When you look inside, you see a big void. From this void, you see the whole project up to the last floor, which is the Saha, or town square. As you go through, you're going to see a welcoming facade that actually draws you inside of the project. This facade is made out of a mesh that helps plants grow on it so that it becomes more organic and vernacular, so that the plants are brought back to life by the water of the Ain itself. The whole project becomes alive and you can see the life through the facade. It's mostly transparent and actually blends in with its natural surroundings. As a whole, the project is condensed into one singular structure that is retaining all the water behind it. We are binding the village together and bringing old inhabitants together with the market, not in the traditional way that a village is spread out into the landscape, but rather we condense the village to this wall to retain and create this body of water to revive the Ain. The AUB group did something in their village mapping that no one else has to date. Essentially, they did not detail a layout of homes and facilities. As the most collaborative of the submissions at that time, not just with each other, but with the future residents of the village, the students believed strongly that the Palestinians returning needed to have a voice in rebuilding their homes and what that would look like in the long run. Therefore, the structure and village vision, they submitted centered organic growth post-return. I think had we planned the village, they said, it would have been very ironic because it would have looked like an Israeli settlement. That is also a main motive because we do not want the people of Ain Ghazal to be forced to live in a way that doesn't look like them. They will have been immigrants in other places and have adopted new ways of living. But when they come back to Ain Ghazal, they're not just going to lose themselves suddenly because they've come back to the homeland. We felt the best thing we could do was empower the villagers and with our architecture, give them tools to feel secure and more empowered to face past and present oppression. Ain Ghazal in the old days, they said, was a result of years and years and centuries of natural growth and expansion, and that's how we believe a village should grow. So we wanted to give them the option to do that. This sketch of Beit Jibrin, designed by Lu'ay at Birzeit, received the 2018 third place prize. In many ways, Lu'ay's explanation on a conceptual approach to village design is the most integrative of surrounding areas. He admits pretty quickly that he does not presume to know how this should play out, but insists that every reconstruction needs to also be a revitalization of relationships. The historical role of a village economically and its relationship to surrounding towns and cities was important to me, he explained. How can we revive not just villages, but these relations and district spaces? The connector between two places or two cities is not just a road, but the lives of people in those villages and in those spaces in between. Here, Lu'ay's potential solution, in quotes, in a decolonized future is not only to revive connection, but to use the destroyed villages as an opportunity to confront fragmentation and, quote, relink the already fragmented enclaves of the West Bank. He proposes instead of restoring them under what are the pre-1948 districts under the British Mandate, that they be considered independent entities, so as to not enlarge the current enclaves. For example, Beit Jibrin in Muhafazat al-Khalil, in the Hebron district. Lu'ay clarified that he does not intend to add yet another fragmented entity, but that these independent spaces would be situated as ones that link previous West Bank to a dwelling space in another previously occupied part of Palestine. So going من الضفة لأراضي 48, for example. The link is based in infrastructure and activities with potential, in the case of Beit Jibrin, to serve as a transit stop between a major economic hub and a coastal city. Beit Jibrin would be a place to market the products of both cities through different expositions and daily markets and warehouses in the village. He extends the function of these linking entities to advancing sustainability, pitching the village site as an ideal location for a power plant that doubles for solid waste disposal and reuse, bonding the entities together rather than leaving each city and district to act on its own. Lu'ay's linking entities for Beit Jibrin take the dwelling to rebuild perspective one step further, as he considers the potential for an entirely new set of inter-village relations in a liberated nation. His conceptualization of new paths and roles between villages offers an additional expansion of Ingold's dwelling perspective. For Ingold also, the world is not everywhere as space, but everywhere as region. Here he defines a region as a matrix of movement, and places as only nodes in that matrix of movement. In other words, everywhere is perceived through paths of movement, and places do not have locations, but histories. Palestine, alternatively, is perceived in terms of interruption, or perhaps disruption. Interrupted physically via blocked paths to other Palestinian locales and people, and interrupted temporally by stolen futures. In the Palestinian experience, exile and diaspora serve as an expansion of the networks and movements that make up the quote region. Similarly, the competition and the students' designs are a reclamation of paths and movement denied. With hundreds of villages destroyed and depopulated in 1948, the revival of these spaces is central to Palestinian notions of return and a Palestinian map that reflects the population of which it was emptied. The designs, the conversations involved in producing them, and their presentation to the Palestinian community, which is a new facet of this, the winners actually zooming into refugee camps and presenting their designs to the descendants of these villages, is not an abstract exercise. They are cartographic practices that insist on a decolonial future, redotting the map not with historic places, but with future ones. I know that the work we do so often as academics can get a little theoretical, but the reality is that the places we study are not abstract. Palestinians and Hawaiians and indigenous people the world over have not given up on liberation or building better, freer futures. Every day they teach and model sumud and optimism even amidst immense pain. My hope is that this work and these cases highlight more than an intersection of literatures, but an injection of lived experience into our analysis of indigenous mapping and settler colonialism. Whether textual or performative, indigenous cartographies are not merely alternative spatial representations or knowledge systems. They are affirmations of indigenous survival and visions of being in a place that is structured to outlast them. These projects are a call to imagine and work toward a future that does not accept settler spatial permanence as a given. If indigenous communities have not surrendered their futures to settler temporalities, then we cannot surrender our research to it either. Let's see if I can get through this section. In the last several months, as we have watched Israel commit a genocide in Gaza, we have understandably been focused on death, destruction, and loss. When we look back, we know this genocide did not start in October, nor is it limited to the Gaza Strip. We also have to remember with every historical exploration that we conduct that the Palestinian experience and landscape is characterized by more than loss. At its core, almost made it. At its core, the Palestinian story is one that continuously redefines survival across borders and generations. What Palestine provides is opportunity, not a checklist for comparison. Writing on and through Palestine is itself an intervention and forces us to ask questions that challenge our assumptions, not only on settler colonialism, but on the present's relationship to indigeneity, power, empire, and so much more. In each of our disciplines, Palestine has the potential to do work in incredibly different and yet astonishingly similar ways. There's been a lot of talk in the last 5 months about language. headlines and passive voice and doing linguistic gymnastics to avoid assigning agency to Israeli aggression. But I'm more interested today in the agency removed from Palestinians when we are not being killed en masse. Our screens have been filled with destruction and death, the houses murdered that Darwish wrote about. But how many of you, or your friends, or your communities, saw photos of Gaza before October 7th? Palestinian agency built this Gaza. Palestinian creativity and vision and dreams. Besieged and imprisoned, Palestinian Sumud and Gaza made this. And despite everything, they will find a way to make it again. But first, they have to be able to keep deep and sustained breath. And it is on every one of us to make sure we fight for a world of permanent and constant ceasefire where they can. Thank you.